Hello, I'm John Perry, and welcome to Representative Gary Glenn Reports with Representative Gary Glenn.
Good morning.
Representative, good to see you.
Good to see you.
A whole lot to talk about right now. Budget time in Lansing. Your first bill was up in committee this week, so to a degree they're linked too. So let's start off there. We've talked about the situation with the Michigan Economic Growth Authority tax credits that were issued in the 2000s. Obviously, they're having an impact on the state budget even this year, as we're hearing this week. And the fact of the matter is that they extend out to the early 2030s. You and one of your colleagues, Representative Lee Chatfield from up in northern Michigan, are working basically to, is it fair to say, limit any further liability to the taxpayer with that?
That is precisely what we're talking about, and we're allowed to introduce a maximum of 5 bills per month, so have a couple of dozen bills already in the hopper, but this is the first one that's made its way past just simply being introduced. We had a hearing in the House Tax Policy Committee on which I sit a couple of weeks ago, and then last week the bill passed unanimously, so had bipartisan support for a bill that simply says that any employer who currently has one of these mega credit contracts, that those contracts will not be renegotiated to increase the liability to the people of Michigan, to taxpayers, or increase the period of time beyond which the end date of whatever it is now, not going to increase the time period under which taxpayers are liable for what amounts to, if you put them all together, $9 billion hanging out there. I think we figured that averages out between now and 2031, when the program goes away, to about $600,000 a year. We were caught, we freshmen, we didn't have anything to do with it because we weren't in office.
But right when you came
to the 1st of January, but as soon as we came in, we were hit with about $500 million in a what we call here in Lansing a negative supplemental, which simply means that in the middle of the budget year, you have to go in and pass a spending cut package, which we did back in January. By the way, we may, by the time this airs, we're going to know what the outcome was of the May 5th ballot measure. And if taxpayers rejected the $2.1 billion tax increase, we will probably be back in that same position again, where in order to reallocate existing funds to road repair, we're going to be going in and making cuts even in the budget that we just passed. And perhaps maybe we'll go back in and make some further cuts in this year's budget, the one we're operating under right now. But I'm pretty confident we will definitely go in and make cuts in the upcoming year's budget, depending on the outcome of the May 5th ballot measure. If our roads are really the priority that we all talk about them being, and if it is really a matter of public safety, then that's got to be addressed. But anyway, I was gratified to have a bill that I introduced that has now passed unanimously the House Tax Policy.
Strong bipartisan support.
Unanimous bipartisan support. We've had talks with Democratic members as well who have some other suggestions about how to tighten it up even more. I've said, in fact, there was a Democratic state representative standing nearby yesterday when I was being interviewed by a member of the media, and I made a point of speaking loudly and calling to his attention. I said the Democratic representatives' proposals are entirely legitimate. We're going to look at them with an open mind. And that's a good thing. It's a good surprise to find out the number of issues on which we really don't do the political posturing that does happen in Lansing, but on a lot of these issues we work together collaboratively. There's not a philosophical alienation or division on responsible fiscal management. I mean, anyway, I'm just happy to find that it was a unanimous bill. Now it'll go to the full House, probably would come up next week, or maybe by the time this is airing this week. And we'll, of course, keep people in Midland and Bay counties aware of what the outcome is. But this is just one step in the process, but so far so good. I think it'll pass the House. Then we'll see what happens in the Senate, whether or not the governor signs it. But it simply codifies the governor's position. It is the governor's position that his agency, the MEDC, is not going to negotiate any of these further to increase liability or length of time of liability.
But this literally puts it in the law.
That's right. This makes it a matter of law. So I expect if it gets to the governor's desk that he will sign it. So that's first. Now that's not the only. As you mentioned too, we spent two fairly long days last week approving first the general budget and then the school aid budget. I played a significant role in amending both of those budgets. On the overall budget, there was strong sentiment, but there'd been a challenge for, I guess, several years as to how to exactly to word it. But I helped play a role in getting a budget amendment that said we will not spend any tax dollars for any organization that performs abortions. That sentiment was strongly held by a lot of members of the Republican caucus. There was one state representative in particular who's been here 5 years, has, as a matter of principle, refused to vote for each and every budget in the years he's served here because some amount, it used to be as much as $7 million. Last budget year, it was down to $50,000 that was going to Planned Parenthood, which is the country's largest abortion provider. And the polls indicate that even people who believe in the right to abortion have, a lot of those people, even those people, think that it's not their duty through their taxpayers to pay for somebody else's abortion. So anyway, that was an amendment that passed, and there will be no funding for Planned Parenthood from state dollars. There are still federal dollars that pass through the state's hands that go to Planned Parenthood to perform services that our local county health departments could serve. And so I think there's going to be discussion in the future about taking even that federal money and sending it, instead of to a private organization that performs abortions, send it instead to our county health departments to perform the other services, non-abortion services, that Planned Parenthood serves in some of the communities. So that was one of the budget amendments. And then another amendment to the state school aid fund, on which I worked very closely with Midland Superintendent Jerry Wasserman, Public Schools Superintendent Jerry Wasserman, and Board President Jerry Wasserman, Superintendent Mike Sharrow. It was a little bit different than what we had initially intended, but basically, don't want to get too detailed. If we increase the budget amount targeted for at-risk children by $30 million or more, which is still possible, we haven't gotten to the point of resolution on that, but if it increases by $30 million or more, then the Midland Public School Systems would get some of this at-risk money for the first time ever in the history of the program. And if even the fact that the amendment was adopted and then the full education budget was adopted is a toehold for the principle that these at-risk dollars ought to be allocated by the child and not by district. There are about 10% of the school districts in Michigan, including the Midland Public School District, that got none of this at-risk child money, even though 27% of the children in the Midland Public School System meet the qualifications for at-risk. But the threshold is you have to have half or more of your students reach that classification to get any of the money. And this amendment that I got onto our state school aid fund budget will say that if we increase the amount by $30 million or more, then anything in excess of that $30 million is going to be allocated, including the 50 school districts that currently receive none of it, but that thereafter it would be allocated per student. And those 27% of the Midland Public School students who get none of that money now would. So it's a small step. In my conversations with Mike Sharrow and Jerry Wasserman, we acknowledge to each other we make a stand on principle now, and maybe 10 years from now, we get all of the at-risk money allocated on this basis. So just the toehold of principle from which we can fight the next fight incrementally and hopefully reach the ideal situation where every student, no matter where they go to school, no matter which district they live in, if they meet the qualification for being at risk, then they get their fair share of the money, just like 90% of the districts in Michigan do now.
You know, Representative, when we talk about the state budget, we're talking about spending plan of $53 billion. And obviously, as you're pointing out, it's impacting virtually every area of our lives. But along those lines, part of your duty as a state lawmaker, I would have to imagine, would be to go through that with a fine-toothed comb to determine how the people's money is being spent.
Well, and it breaks down to about $38 million for expenditures other than our public schools, and about $15 billion for public schools. And it is, in fact, the largest budget allocation for K through 12 education in Michigan's history. So I don't know how you can throw stones at that. You could quibble with how it was divided up. I mean, we've just talked about that, and I did my best, for example, to reallocate some portion of the budget money to at-risk children in the middle and public school systems. But overall, I don't know how you can throw stones at the record high expenditure for K through 12 education in Michigan in terms of this budget that was just approved. One thing that was surprising is how much of it is federal money that's under federal mandates and federal rules and regs, and I don't like any of that. But the amount of money that we actually control, the general fund money, is a much small, like maybe 20% of the budget, certainly not the bulk of the budget. That portion over which we as state legislators have full control was actually a spending cut, which has not been done. I believe it is in 4 years at least, but it was an actual spending reduction. The overall budget we approved increased by 1% over last budget year, only because the federal money, over which we do not have total control or discretion, increased by over 2%. But the over 2% increase in the federal money balanced against the actual spending cut in what we actually totally control means that overall the budget will increase by 1%. Which
so
is
if people
less
ask
than
if you're
inflation.
holding the line,
It's a pretty
clearly.
conservative budget. And I also commend Representative Cindy Gamrat, who actually serves on the Appropriations Committee. I don't serve on the Appropriations Committee. The committee that does go through every line with a fine-tooth comb, that has the time to do that has spent the last 4 months doing that, going through every line item with a fine-tooth comb. If you're not on that committee, you're somewhat dependent on the judgment that they make. You have to trust your colleagues. But especially, and we'll know by the time this broadcast airs whether or not Prop 1 has been approved or failed. It looks to me like from every poll it has failed. That's going to be my guess, my prediction. By the time this airs, we'll know whether I was a prophet, a good prognosticator or not. But if it has failed by the time we're having this discussion, John, then Cindy Gamrat has identified a list of places she thinks would be appropriate to cut. Places, for example, where the state is subsidizing some form of private enterprise, which just as a matter of principle, I don't think is appropriate. Why would the state be playing favorites, picking winners and losers, giving state tax dollars to one provider of a certain good or service, and the other folks have to compete with the state subsidized entity? That doesn't seem fair. But there is a list from somebody who is on the Appropriations Committee who has gone through those line items. And there'll be a lot of other people who talk about ways we can allocate money to fix our roads if we have to, and I'm convinced we will have to. But Cindy has a line item. I think she had about 15, 20 amendments the other day that were ready to go. And the other thing to understand about this budget, the House has passed its budget now, both for school aid and for all other spending. The Senate has to pass its own budget, and we are told that's still several weeks to come. They won't be identical. And then there'll be this grand meeting of Senate and House members and their appropriations subcommittees, and they'll wrestle out over coming to some kind of agreement, that, resolving the differences. Then both houses have to agree to those agreements. Then the governor has to approve it. And all of this is as our founding fathers designed it, so that you don't have dictatorial powers or all power associated in a small number of people. But this is just the first step. The budget we've just passed is not going to be the budget that's finally approved by both houses and signed by the governor, but this is our first step as members of the House of Representatives.
You're on a timeline to finish work on the budget by the end of May, the start of June, I would imagine, for your schools.
That's right.
For locals who generally begin their fiscal year at the start of July, having that type of information early is far preferable to what we saw back in the last decade.
That's right.
When the budget was not finished until September, or sometimes even after the start of the fiscal year in October.
Well, and that's one of the significant accomplishments of the Republican-controlled legislature since 2010. So now we're in our 5th year of Republican control, and just as you indicated, John, they used to present the budget to the local school districts and cities and counties in October sometime, well after their fiscal years had started. So local government units and school boards were trying to read a crystal ball and allocate their budgets having no clue what they were going to receive in terms of state funding. So now, by meeting the deadline, the self-imposed deadline, the standard of having our budget done by June 1st, which is, I think, going to be the case, then all the local governments, school boards, counties, and cities have adequate information. They know what's going to be coming from Lansing. I know the attitude, especially in the school aid fund, and I'm an advocate for local control, but that kind of principle is evident in this budget that we just passed. More of Lansing meddling, or Lansing meddling less, returning more local autonomy to school boards.
Which schools have been asking for.
Exactly. And remove the excuse of Lansing makes us do that or doesn't make us do that. I mean, this is just one small step, however. There's also, I co-sponsored legislation with Democratic Representative Andy Shore to form a commission to study all the rules and regs and reporting requirements we put on public school teachers and school districts to see if they're redundant, repetitive. We can get that off their backs. And also, here's another one that I think is pretty significant. There was a bill that came out last week before the House that was the early warning bill. And it was intended for the state to get an early warning of the fiscal stability of all our school districts, and it applied to all school districts across the state, including those that are nowhere near any time of financial trouble. And I've repeatedly heard this from the school districts that I represent in Bay and Midland counties, is that you have isolated school districts around the state that perform poorly and are poor fiscal managers, and the legislature writes new rules and regs and applies it to everybody. One size fits all, paint everybody with the same brush. I got a call from, or an email, excuse me, from the school superintendent in Bullock Creek, a district that I represent, a school district I represent in Midland County, who said those exact same things. You're going to force us to do an additional unfunded mandate, the staff time of filling out all these reports. And so I told members of my caucus that on the basis of that communication, I was not going to support that bill. There were enough members of the Republican caucus who took the same position, just enough, the magic number, which put it in doubt as to whether the bill could pass. And as a result, we got an amendment passed that said only school districts that have less than an 8% financial reserve at the end of the last budget year would be required. The ones that, because the accounting standard is to be safe, they ought to be at 10%. We said we'll set it at 8%. Any school under 8% in terms of a financial reserve is going to have to fulfill these reporting requirements so that we have as much advance notice as possible at the state level. Why is this important? Because if a school district goes bankrupt, as we've had school districts do or come close to, like the Buena Vista district went bankrupt, went away. If that happens, the taxpayers of Michigan are liable, all of us. And so we're protecting the taxpayers of Michigan. I'm protecting the taxpayers of Bay and Midland counties. The end result, I said I'm willing to consider this 8%, but I want to see a printout from the Department of Education of how this 8% threshold, how's that divide up the public school districts? Is it 50-50? Is it 90-10? It turns out it's 60-40. So because of the amendment and the printout, I was told by the sponsor of the bill that the printout I insisted on having from the Department of Education is what won them the votes it took to pass the bill. So apparently I was able to play an effective role in adjusting the trajectory of this bill. The end result is that all the school districts in Midland County will not have to comply with this new unfunded mandate or spend staff time having to come up with all these reports. Some of the other school districts over in Bay County will, because they fell under the 8% reserve. But nonetheless, I was at least able to protect some of the school districts that are not in any situation of financial distress from this additional requirement. And through either a blue ribbon commission appointed by the chairman of the House Education Committee or by this formation of a more formal committee, if the bill that I've co-sponsored becomes law, I know there is the intent to review all the unfunded mandates we put on the backs of school districts, try to alleviate as many of them as possible. This budget reflects the idea of giving them the money to spend. No school district will lose money under this budget if it were to pass as the House passed it, but to give them the money to spend and then trust our local school officials. The local school officials in the district that I represent, John, have been very graciously receptive to my observation that just because I got one more vote than the other guy, or in my case the gal last year, that didn't suddenly make me smarter than our local school superintendents or board members on the issue of education. I have to be able to address Vice Chairman of Energy Commission, energy policy, tax policy, social issues, all the gambit of the hundreds, maybe thousands of issues that come before us in Lansing. Our elected officials on the school boards, they focus on one public policy issue, and it applies to me individually, it applies to us collectively here in Lansing. We didn't suddenly become smarter or care more about the kids back in our districts just because we got the votes to get elected to go to Lansing, be a member of the state legislature. So I do trust Jerry Wasserman, Mike Sharrow, the other Michael View up in Pinconning, the other school districts that I represent. I trust that they know better than I do. I've also got a bill, I think we discussed earlier, that would allow them to make the decision to hire a retired Dow chemist if they thought he was qualified to teach. Not just qualified because of his knowledge of the subject matter, but that they judged him qualified to effectively teach first graders through eighth graders if a retired Dow chemist volunteered as a community service to teach chemistry. So I'm trying just to follow this line of thought that we ought to trust our local elected officials to make the best judgments they can, and as much as possible get Lansing out of the way.
Representative, another topic you have been working on and your colleagues have been working on is the topic of civil asset forfeiture. A lot of people would argue that there's very much a need for reform there. Folks have probably seen media accounts of police agencies confiscating property, not always giving it back. Along those lines, you're working toward reform. What does your bill do? What does the total package do?
We've raised the threshold to clear and convincing evidence that the property being seized was in fact associated somehow with criminal activity. The horror stories that have resulted from the way the law is now is that somebody might be arrested or charged with a crime and his property seized, his home or his boat or his car or cash, and the property is seized by a local law enforcement agency, and then he's not convicted. He was a suspect, but he's not convicted. But he lost his property, and it was sold off, auctioned off, and used for the local law enforcement agency's budget. Well, that's where the point of concern is that we're protecting the rights of innocent property owners while also protecting the ability of our local law enforcement agencies to not only prosecute, but in the occasions when something is involved in criminal activity, to seize it for the public benefit. But we have changed just slightly the threshold of evidence that has to be evident in order to seize property. And that goes above and beyond the question of arresting somebody, charging them, putting them in jail. Should their private property be confiscated? My bill deals directly with public nuisances, whether or not something is associated with criminal activity. There was a lot of concern. I got significant constituent contact about the no-fault legislation that passed the Senate in a way that some people thought was faster than it should have. And it was taken up fairly quickly in the House. I believe we're at a point where that process has been slowed down, that nothing's going to happen immediately, that it's going to be on a deliberative process. I think at this point, and I may be wrong, I think maybe the House and Representative Tom Leonard will come up with his own proposal, our own proposal, to address this. We have some of the highest insurance rates in the country, and we really are an outlier in respect to this unlimited catastrophic coverage for people who suffer severe, crippling injuries in an automobile accident. There's some interesting philosophical questions. If you break your neck in a car accident or you break it skiing, you don't get the same kind of coverage. People who are injured severely in an automobile accident have unlimited catastrophic coverage for a lifetime. If you're injured some other way, you're treated differently. Now we have the Obamacare mandates coming down on top of everybody everywhere, which raises the question of, do we really need an exorbitant, limitless liability coverage in the future when you have Obamacare doing what it has done to our medical system? But whatever the answer to that is, and I think the focus should be on protecting people who've been victims, but somehow finding a way to reduce the cost. That ought to be our focus, but whatever it is, it's going to be a deliberative, slower process. with the House, I believe, coming up with its own proposals. So the sense of urgency, like people had to contact their legislators this week because we're going to vote on it this week. At some point, I think there was that possibility, but that's no longer the case. It's going to be a slower, more deliberative process where all of us have the opportunity to hear from our constituents, and they don't have to be worrying about having to talk to us today.
Finally, Representative, in the couple of 3 minutes we have left, you were out in Omaha, Nebraska to receive the Everett Dirksen Award, named after the former U.S. Senate Republican leader, for your work on the right to work issue.
Yep, that's correct. I was honored to receive the top award given by the National Right to Work Committee. The governor of Nebraska was in attendance when the award was presented, so certainly my honor to be recognized in that respect. Everett Dirksen was the senator from Illinois, the Republican minority leader in the United States Senate in the 60s, who filibustered the legislation by President Lyndon Johnson to try and eliminate the right of any state to pass a right to work law. A right to work law being one that protects the individual's freedom to choose whether to join or pay dues to a union, and basically protects the right of conscience in the workplace, and says you're free to join a union if you want to financially support a union, but you can't be compelled to do so under threat of being fired as a condition of employment. So Dirksen was the champion of protecting that right under federal law of the states. So certainly an honor to have been recognized based on my work. Led the campaign to pass a right to work law in the state of Idaho back in the 1980s. Larry Reed, who later became president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Midland, lived in Idaho at the time, ran a similar group. When he came back to Midland, became president of the Mackinac Center about 10 years later, after I had led that fight, recruited me to move to Midland in 1998 to address other free market and free choice type issues. So I played a leadership role in Idaho. I was actually a lobbyist for the National Right to Work Committee for 1 year on Capitol Hill in Washington, and was a founding board member of the Michigan Freedom to Work Coalition that launched the effort that succeeded in passing right to work here in Michigan. And I'm glad to say again that in our first full year as a right to work state, Michigan led the nation in new job creation for manufacturing employment, almost 25,000 new jobs, and number 2 in the nation was Indiana, the other state that passed a right to work law in 2012. So it's not just a matter of individual freedom. I like to call it a freedom and jobs issue. It's a freedom of choice, rights of conscience issue, which also happens to be a major attraction to new business and industry locating in Midland, setting up plant sites, and creating jobs. So in the first full year after we had that law in effect, to be number 1 in the nation, that's been a long time coming for the state of Michigan. And I'm happy for my constituents in the 2 counties that I represent, and for people in manufacturing employment all across the state. So very proud to have played a role in that, and humbled and to have received that kind of recognition.
People have a question or comment, give you a call, drop you an email.
Do all of that. If they'd like to be on our email newsletter distribution list, they should go to repgaryglenn.com, R-E-P, GaryGlenn.com. They can sign up there. They can see where, my phone number, all the different ways they can contact me. And we'll also have on there our office hours. We asked the local news media, the Midland paper, the Bay City paper, to also publish where we're going to be having office hours. And they're starting to do that, and look forward to meeting with constituents. If I can help them over the phone or through email, we're happy to do that. We had a meeting with my staff today stressing how important it is to respond to each and every person from my district. Sometimes we hear from people that aren't in the district, but every person from my district should have an acknowledgement of their communication, and we'll do our best to be responsive. Can't please everybody on every issue, but I'm not going to hide the ball. If I'm going to vote a certain way, I'll tell people. On the no-fault issue, I told people honestly I was still getting information, and that will continue to be the process as we look at that on a deliberative basis. But anyway, great to spend this time with you this week, John, and I know there'll be far more to talk about in another couple of weeks.